In this video, we're going to take a look at how we can create a custom API action for our custom connector. A custom API action will essentially allow you to call any available API against the resource this custom connector is configured for. To do this, we'd start this off like any other action flow. We'd add the action event card. Then we'd add our helper flow that we created earlier. It's our HTTP helper. We'd fill in some options, inputs, whatever's required to fill out the inputs on the helper flow, and then take the outputs and make sure those are returned to the connector and workflow designer. We'll take a look at a preconfigured custom API flow to see how this all works. So again, here we see our connector action with our authentication object, our options, inputs, and outputs. We'll take a quick look at how we have our options configured. So in here, we have our options group, and we just have one field in this case, which is request type, and I've configured this as a drop-down, made it required. And this just has your basic HTTP request methods here. Taking a look over on the preview side, we can see this is what we have here. Next down, we have our inputs, and in here we have 4 different fields. We've called the group name request, and we have our relative URL, which is a text type, and I made this required, and then 3 different objects for our query, headers, and body. And if we take a look over at our preview card here, again, we have our options here for our type. We'll just select one of these and click Save to see how these will be exposed on the custom API action card and in the workflow designer. So here we have our fields, and then we have our outputs here, and that's what I'll show you next. Our outputs are in this response object, and this maps to the response group on our outputs card up here. Taking a look at this, we have our group name response, and we have 3 different fields here. Our status code, which is a number, and then 2 objects for headers and body. And these align to the object types that we will drag over to the output card from our HTTP helper card. Again, taking a look in our preview, this is what it looks like for our output on our custom API action card there. And in between, we have our helper flow that we created earlier, HTTP helper. And with our input fields, relative URL, request method, query, headers, and body. And these are all obtained from our connector action card here. So our relative URL, query, headers, and body from our inputs, a request type from the options on the card, and then our connection is obtained from the connector action card itself. We have the status code, headers, and bodies output, which we've dragged over to our return outputs, and that will provide the data back to the calling card in the workflow. Taking a look in our workflow designer, we can see this in action. So we add app action. We've only deployed a test version of this, so we'll click include test connectors. And here we see our custom API action. We'll select the request type, save that, and we can see our fields, both for the input and for the output. And we'll just run this really quick to make sure it returns the data we expect. And it looks like it's working. So the next step would be to deploy a private version of this connector.